Okay, in this video I will say a little bit about Spinoza's life and the main themes in his philosophy. So Spinoza was born in 1632 in the Netherlands. His family was both Jewish and Portuguese. The reason for that is many Portuguese Jews were fleeing anti-Semitic persecution shortly prior to that. About 100 years before Spinoza's birth, his grandparents moved to Amsterdam. And the primary reason for that was that in Amsterdam, the Dutch state was welcoming Jewish refugees who were fleeing persecution from Portugal. And it's important to say a little bit about that. So in the 17th century, there was a thriving Jewish community who was living in Amsterdam, and most of them were Portuguese and were Sephardic. Sephardic are the Jewish people who came from Spain and Portugal, and they were living there under very strict rules. So at the time, the state was a Christian state. It was ruled by what were called Calvinists, Protestants who followed the theology of Calvin. And they believed, for example, that God has predecided your future. So they believed in divine predestination. And they were very, very strict in terms of morality and religious practice. So the Jews who were living in Amsterdam in the 17th century were allowed to live there fairly peacefully. It was one of the few places in Europe in which it was possible for a Jewish person to do this. The rest of Europe was largely persecuting Jews. And so there were many who came from Spain and from Portugal, and had developed a little community there. What's important also is that the Jewish community that was living there had elements that it had inherited from its Portuguese origin, because the Jews who had fled from Portugal were forcibly converted to Catholicism by the Portuguese state, and either executed, killed, if they didn't do so, or simply kicked out of the country. So many of them had for a period at least, lived as Catholics while practicing Judaism secretly at home. So the Netherlands was a very attractive place for Sephardic Jews, because this was one of the few places they could publicly live as Jews, so long as they accepted the rules set out by the Dutch state. So Spinoza was born here in 1632. By this time, the Jews had been living there for quite a while, and his family were mostly merchants. And Spinoza was raised with a traditional Jewish education. So he was trained to read the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses. And he got a Talmudic education as well, the study of the Talmud. But his main kind of purpose in life was to become a merchant of his parents' business, his father's business. But this didn't go so well, because Spinoza had what at the time were considered heretical views. And I'm not going to get into great detail about his theology in this video. This video is just kind of introductory. But the Jewish community that he was part of felt that he had heretical views. So one of his views that he's somewhat known for is that the Torah is not the word of God, that the first 5 books of Moses weren't in fact even written by Moses, but multiple people, and that it was very much a human creation. Now Spinoza didn't deny the existence of God, but he didn't believe the Bible was the Word of God. Now, saying that today may not sound so amazing or radical, but in the time it was quite radical, and some people viewed it as extreme to say such a thing. And so Spinoza was denounced as a heretic. Many thought he was an atheist even. So he quickly, in his early 20s, the rabbis in his community, which was called Talmud Torah, became very kind of weary of Spinoza and his ideas. And so in his 20s, he was banned and excommunicated from Amsterdam. He was given what was called the Gesherim, which is kind of excommunication. In most cases, the Gesherim was a kind of suspension. So if you received this, maybe you would have to do community service, or you wouldn't be allowed to interact with people in the community for a few days or a few weeks, or you had to pay a fine. It was a kind of internal kind of punishment that the Jewish community of Amsterdam would administer to ensure that people were respecting both the religious rules of the rabbis, but also to make sure they wouldn't come under attack by the Dutch authorities. Because as I said, they were there as refugees escaping anti-Semitic persecution from the Portuguese. And so they were very, very strict. And so anyone who was perceived as being radical would have been kind of subject to criticism, and in some cases, as Spinoza, the Gesherim, the excommunication. So at about the age of 25, Spinoza left Amsterdam. He began by spending some time with people that were at that time called humanists. Some of them were early Quakers, as what they were called. And Spinoza made a living teaching secular and Christian scholars Hebrew. Spinoza had received a traditional Jewish education, of which Hebrew was a major part. He was very much able to teach this. And so at the age of about 25, Spinoza left Amsterdam, and he lived for a while in the city of Leiden. Leiden is a very important city in the 17th century because this is where the biggest university in the Netherlands was located. And he spent some time there studying the work of René Descartes. René Descartes was a French philosopher, but lived most of his life in the Netherlands, and was the father of a type of philosophy called Cartesianism. The main ideas of Cartesianism is, number one, everything that can be known through reason. What's knowable is rational. Number two, the most important tool for achieving knowledge is science. Although science was understood quite differently in Spinoza and Descartes' time as it is today, science was more of a kind of method to try to achieve certainty in your investigation, but was quite different from what today would be called the scientific method, and is what physicists and chemists and all the rest of it, what they do. So Spinoza lived a bit of time in Leiden, and there developed a close friendship with many of the pioneers of science in his time. But then later, in the later years of his life, he settled in one of the largest cities in the Netherlands called Den Haag, sometimes called The Hague. A very important city today still, not just in the Netherlands, but the world. It's a place where you have the United Nations as the International Criminal Court is located in Den Haag. It's today also the seat of the Dutch government. But this is where Spinoza lived. And he spent a good deal of his adult life living in Den Haag and writing. Now Spinoza did not publish significant amount of writings in his lifetime, but the main work by which he's known is a work called the Ethica. He wrote in Latin. That was the language that people wrote in at the time, because it was universally used across Europe. So people who spoke many different languages could communicate in Latin. So Spinoza wrote the Ethica. In addition to this, he wrote a book called the Theologicus Politicus Tractatus, and this text is a kind of work on theology and particularly biblical criticism. For many people, Spinoza today is known as the kind of father of scientific biblical criticism, a kind of historical method that tries to put the Torah in its historical context, rather than viewing it through religious or metaphysical or spiritual lenses, but rather viewed it as a kind of historical document, kind of chronicling the history of the Jewish people, the people of Israel. And so I want to say a few more things about his life. He lived in Den Haag. He made his living while he was living there as a lens grinder. It was very important discipline at the time. Lens grinding was important because at the time people had discovered the microscope, the telescope, and Spinoza spent his time making very sought-after lenses. Apparently he was very skilled at his art. He was very respected for this. And some of the pioneering scientists of the time purchased Spinoza's lenses. So he died at a fairly early age. Most people think he died from inhaling the fumes from the glass that he inhaled while he was grinding the lenses. He was a very controversial figure at his time. Many people wanted to arrest Spinoza in the state and prosecute him for some of his ideas, which I'll now say a little bit about. So what were Spinoza's main ideas? So I'm going to talk about these in more detail in a few separate videos, but the first one is what is called Pantheism. So Spinoza was very much a man who was obsessed with God. The way that Spinoza understood God is quite different from the Christian understanding of God. So in Christianity, the way that God is generally thought of, although there's many theological debates, is as something that is transcendent. So something entirely transcendent from all of being and all of reality. God is beyond the world. God is absolutely beyond, in a kind of heaven. And God is this figure who gives the world a kind of order and who is kind of constantly judging people based on their actions. Also, the Christian conception of God assumes heaven and hell, and kind of retribution and punishment for your actions. And but this is quite different in Spinoza's conception of God. So the way that Spinoza understood God was generally is known as pantheism. And pantheism is the idea that God can be found in absolutely everything that exists, but at the same time, God is not reducible to anything that exists. So Spinoza thought that God was not something transcendent from the world, beyond the world, but immanent in the world. Spinoza thought that God resided absolutely everywhere and in each particular place in the universe and in the world, while at the same time being absolutely different from everything that exists in the world. But the way that Spinoza understood this was through a very rational kind of logical, philosophical vocabulary. He didn't invoke the language of theology, or Christian theology, but took a much more kind of conceptual, philosophical approach to this. Now, we'll look at this in another video, but that's one of his main ideas. And his idea was that the way that a person gets close to God is not through prayer necessarily, or through um, necessarily contemplating what God is, but by living a joyous, happy life, and trying to find joy and enjoyment, um, and trying to find God in that enjoyment and activity that one does. This is very much a part of Spinoza's philosophy, and the way that Spinoza thought of good and evil. He thought good and evil existed. Um, was he thought that good is what allows us to become more perfect. And to become more perfect is to effectively realize our relationship to God. This was essentially a major part of Spinoza's idea. And what his book, The Ethics, kind of tells you about is how you can begin to live that way, so that you can live joyously and thereby freely. And freedom occupies a very important role in Spinoza's philosophy. But for Spinoza, freedom doesn't mean, for example, that you could do whatever you want, that you just, everything that you do. Spinoza actually very much viewed the importance of laws and living in a law-governed society and being a part of a community. He didn't like the idea of individualism. He frowned upon this very much. But he thought that to be free is to be someone who lives by reason. And for him, to live by reason is also to live a kind of godly life. This was his idea. Now, many scholars have tried to argue that Spinoza was essentially an atheist, and one reason for this was that in his philosophy there seems to be an indication that Spinoza equated God with nature. Sometimes in his writings he says God or nature, but this is not the case, as I'll show in the next video, where I go into detail and look at Spinoza's work on theology. Spinoza makes a distinction between the naturing nature and nature that's been natured, between what he calls substance and the modes of substance. And this distinction, as we'll see, is very important, because what Spinoza will say is that nature, the way that we talk about nature, so for example, the trees, water, the earth, the planet, all of this is part of the nature of nature. These are all effects of God's divine essence. But for Spinoza, God is something absolutely different and other from the natured nature, from the planet, from the earth, but at the same time is identical to it. There's this kind of dialectical identity and difference that we find in Spinoza's theology. So I'm going to argue in the next video that Spinoza was not an atheist, and that this is a very strong misunderstanding. He was a materialist, and what do I mean by this? It doesn't mean he believed in living a materialistic life, but he was a materialist in the philosophical sense, that he thought that being and the material world are primary, and that this is where we should begin. We don't need to look beyond or outside of being or outside of the material world, because within the material world and within being, we can already discover the immanence of God, the immanence of the divine. Now, some scholars have noted that Spinoza's ideas about God are very similar to a movement that developed about 50 years after Spinoza's life, called Hasidic Judaism. Hasidic Judaism arose in Eastern Europe, and was there's essentially a very similar idea that you should try to find God in a kind of joyous space. In Hasidic Judaism, there's a lot of focus on communal dancing, for example, and trying to find God in that, in dancing and in doing things joyously together in a group, and trying to find God in every little small part of one's life, rather than in some transcendent heaven that one will never have any direct experience of. And the word experience, I think, very much emphasizes that. So some people have found that there's a similarity to this. And I'll discuss this in the next video. So besides this, besides theology, Spinoza was someone who believed in the faith of science. He was very interested in the scientific developments of his time. Some people have also noted that some of the primary views of modern psychology were first developed by Spinoza. One of the things you find in his book, The Ethics, is an attempt to kind of distinguish between every single possible emotional state that a person could go through. And some people say that this is a kind of early kind of psychology. It wasn't psychology in the scientific sense, because I mean Spinoza wasn't engaging in scientific exploration, but it was very much a kind of early attempt to understand the human psyche, the human mind, in a more kind of precise way. Okay, so just to close, I'll talk a little bit about Spinoza's legacy. So, as I said, in Spinoza's lifetime, he was excommunicated from his own community, his own Jewish community, who shunned him and very much disowned him. Today, he's buried in Den Haag, in the backyard of a Protestant church, which is very strange because Spinoza wasn't Protestant; he was Jewish, and many of his ideas about God and morality seem to retain many of his early kind of ideas that he would have gotten from his Jewish upbringing. But Spinoza, after Spinoza died, he continued to remain a subject of controversy, and he influenced many thinkers, from Karl Marx to some of the existentialists of the 20th century, particularly Martin Buber, very important modern philosopher. What I want to talk about now to close the video is a little bit about how to read Spinoza. So in this book, The Ethics, you will find that the book is very difficult. You'll find that Spinoza writes in this almost impossible way. And the way to read Spinoza is not to focus too much on whether or not you're understanding it, but to read him very carefully, to read him very slowly. So take a look first at his definitions and his axioms, and take a few hours and try to think about what he might mean. I would actually suggest not going and looking on Google, searching what Spinoza means by this or that word, but just looking at the words and trying to think what might he have meant, rather than trying to focus on whether or not you understand it. Because I'll tell you, I don't think anyone ever fully really understands Spinoza. There are people who literally spend their entire lives studying Spinoza and don't fully understand it. But what I would suggest is you write down his definitions and you make notes on them, and you try to understand. You try to feel the concepts. Try to think about what it might mean. Maybe discuss it with someone that's close to you. And then go through these propositions that he gives. You'll find that he tries to write in this almost kind of geometrical style. And Spinoza very much believed that philosophy should try to be as rigorous and systematic as possible, and this is why you find his ideas presented in this geometrical style. So what you'll want to do is go through each of the propositions, write them down, and then make some notes on them, and try to relate each proposition to them. And what I would actually suggest is, if you're going to read the first chapter, or part 1 on God, where Spinoza lays out his pantheistic theory of God, which I have here in front of me, it's best to read first his definitions. For example, by substance, I mean that which is in itself and is conceived through itself. That is, that the conception of which does not require the conception of another thing from which it has to be formed. Now that might seem very complicated, and I will do a whole video discussing Spinoza's notion of substance. But I would suggest trying to think about what that means. Try to put it in your own words. And then go through these propositions. So, for example, proposition 1, substance is by nature prior to its affections. Try to understand what that means. Try to think about what he means by that. And I would suggest dividing this up into, start with propositions 1 through 7, because they belong together. And then once you kind of have a sense of what he's talking about there, go to propositions 8 through 11, where he proves the existence of God, or at least he attempts to. And then, you want to go through the rest of the propositions to proposition 15, where Spinoza says, whatever is in God, and nothing can be or be conceived without God. Now, what I would absolutely urge you to do is to kind of suspend, kind of put in brackets, your preconceived notions of how you think about God or divinity, whatever beliefs you were raised with, or what you believe. And it's fine, you can believe what you like, but put that aside and try to understand what Spinoza is trying to do. And don't try to understand Spinoza's theology through the lens of Christianity or any other religion, for that matter. But just try to understand it on his own terms. Because what I'll tell you is his way of thinking about God is entirely different from the Christian or other religious traditions' ways of thinking about God. So I would urge you to do that. So in the next video, I'll be talking about the ethics, part 1, and try to help you make sense of this. But before you look at that video, I suggest you go through each proposition and just try to understand it yourself. And don't focus too much on whether or not you understand it, but just give Spinoza some time. And learning to read Spinoza is very much like learning a new language, because you're going to be introduced to a bunch of new words that you'll never have heard before, and you just want to kind of let it sink in, and then eventually you'll start to come up with your own interpretation of God, of Spinoza, or of what Spinoza means by these terms. Okay, this is all I'm going to talk about today.